When you think of the Wild West, what comes to mind? If you're like most people, visions of high noon showdowns and stagecoach robberies, dusty frontier towns with bustling saloons and lone gunslingers of dubious origins probably flood your mind. For a lot of people, the Wild West is a static world inhabited with larger than life characters and unbelievable tales, like any great genre. And these stories transport us to that very distinct time and place full of danger and intrigue that nevertheless draws us back again and again. But the West is also a series of conflicting narratives about a real place in time and space. See, the West is more than just cowboys and shootouts. In fact, I don't see it as just a place at all. I think it's an ever-evolving story, a set of ideas and ideals about morality, heroism, survival, and it's also the questioning and reimagining of these ideas. Today we're going to look at 5 Western novels that trace the development of this wonderful and terrifying genre, the changing landscape of the Western frontier, through some of the most memorable and impactful stories ever written about the Wild West. So let's begin. First, we start our journey with the myth that started everything. So many of the tropes of the Western, saloons, shootouts, frontier towns, are so readily available to us now that I think it's easy to forget that a very few writers, drawn partially from their experiences and partially from their imaginations, were the first to bring back these riveting tales from the frontier to the reading publics of their time in Europe and the more established East Coast. One of the greatest and most impactful books written on early West was Riders of the Purple Sage, written in 1912 by Zane Grey. This book's impact is really hard to overestimate. It basically invented the Western genre. Lone riders, sweeping canyons, clear good and evil, white hat, black hat kind of idea. Romantic, epic, unforgettable. Think of this as the West that we dream about before we meet the people who actually lived there. This didn't just tell the story of the West, it defined how we imagine the Western really for generations. And of course, there are many other classic Western myths. Owen Wister's The Virginian was written more than a decade before this, and is definitely an important one too. But Riders of the Purple Sage really popularized the genre. And I think this book is a great example of the West as legend, the West before reality intrudes. So book 1, the myth, Riders of the Purple Sage. Next comes the hero, one of the most memorable and inspiring elements of the classic Western is the unquestionable bravery of the heroic man of the West. When you think of classic Westerns, this will almost inevitably happen. There will be a hard man who stands in the way of bad men, a statement that goodness and niceness are really not the same thing. Perhaps the best example of this classic kind of narrative is Shane, written by Jack Schaefer in 1949. And this story, it's really about this mysterious gunslinger who shows up to help a family under threat and then disappears. He's at once an example of a good man in a hard world, both as a father figure and also kind of like a self-sacrificing, duty over feelings, virtuous man in an unvirtuous world. Shane isn't just a character, though. He represents the ideal Western hero, noble, selfless, almost mythic. Here we see the hero of the West, the kind of representative of the tough and rough defender of civilization against barbarism, in this case particularly against the greedy cattle ranchers, become something necessary but temporary. Subtly, Shane tells us that the West needs heroes, but it can't hold on to them. The hero is real, but he doesn't belong to the world he saves. In winning, he helps create a new world that has no more use for hard men like him anymore. So, book 2 here, the temporary hero, Shane. Next, we have to see some more complexity enter the narrative as we explore community and morality, because not every story about the West is about the same kind of active myth that we're familiar with. The Shootist, written in 1975 by Glendon Swarthout, I hope I'm not butchering the pronunciation of his name there. This is a classic Western novel turning inward, right? Away from the myth towards the person behind the myth, which is so interesting to see. I love when they do this in every genre, right? The individual conscience of a legend of the West as he grapples with life choices, example in the future. In The Shootist, Basically, J.B. Brooks, he's an aging gunman who, when we were introduced to him at the beginning, has been diagnosed with cancer and is facing his imminent mortality. The narrative is less about the legendary feats and his reputation, though of course those show up to remind us who he is. And it's far more about the value of choices at the end of one's life, when options are far more limited. Particularly for a man who knew no boundaries in the past, we follow J.B. Brooks as he chooses how to live out his final days, connecting with real people, protecting a town, perhaps even leaving a legacy. You'll have to read it to find out how it plays out, of course, but I chose The Shootist here because it's short, fast-paced, full of reflection on and in the West. Sometimes the West isn't just about the action, it's about choices and honor, and what matters in the end isn't the legend of the West, but how a man chooses to live out his days as the legend is dying. So, Book 3, The Man Behind the Legend, The Shootist. But of course, the West isn't all heroics and morality, right? When we're exploring the evolution of the West, it can get very dark. When we look back on many of the real events that coincided with the development of the frontier, we see not only growth, potential, building, we see all those things, but we also see indifference, brutality, and destruction. Cowboy and Indian spoofs materialize into gory battles with indigenous peoples, and the exciting adventures of hunters can be shown to be the near extinction of the plains bison, for example. So the next novel, Butcher's Crossing by John Williams, not the composer, really strips away all the romance of the West. And all this romance we've taken for granted up until now is gone. We're confronted with the existential questions and the reality of carnage. In Butcher's Crossing, we follow a young man and a crew that he encounters who are obsessed with hunting buffalo as they face harsh, empty landscapes. Nature doesn't care or hope for his hopes and riches. It doesn't care about what any of them want, right? The setting, we almost meet for the first time the West, the setting of the West itself as a character. And this book forces us to look at it without averting our gaze or trying to see only what we want to see. Butcher's Crossing is a beautifully written, subtle deconstruction of the West that asks us to consider, what if the West wasn't a story at all, but just a place that didn't care about you or frankly anything? So here the frontier becomes almost anti-human, stripped of meaning, stripped of myth, very unforgiving story, a place that doesn't care whether you survive or not. So book 4 confronts us with the reality here, Butcher's Crossing. Now finally, we come to the true deconstruction, the harshest, most uncharitable view of the West that you are likely to ever encounter. This is a book that is so brutal, it is said that it can never be made into a film. Blood Meridian by Cormac McCarthy. And although this is arguably one of the most critically acclaimed novels of the late 20th century, I advise caution and research before diving into this book because in many ways it is horrific and it will stay with you. But on the other hand, you'll never be able to see the West the same way. So I wouldn't recommend this to everyone, though I could discuss this for hours. It's a fascinating novel. But if you still think the West is noble and you're willing to challenge this belief, this is the book to read. Full of violence and chaos and philosophical terror, right? This myth that we've explored so far is basically burned to ash in Blood Meridian. This is the West after we take the fantasy away, and it's terrifying and unforgiving. After looking at the West through the eyes of Blood Meridian, it can be very hard to go back to the West that we enjoyed in our childhood, the myth with lighthearted, unadulterated fun. But perhaps we can go back with slightly bittersweet, mature perspectives that get a lot, maybe more, out of the classic tales of the West this time. Because here the Western novel becomes something closer to philosophy or nightmare even than just a tale. So Blood Meridian reminds us that the myth of the West was always built on violence and that what's left when you face it. So book 5 here, the brutal deconstruction, is Blood Meridian. So 5 books, 5 versions of the West. The dream, the hero, the man behind the myth, the reality, the deconstruction. These aren't just stories. And just because a story was written more recently or is more cynical doesn't necessarily mean it's more accurate than the other. more optimistic perspectives or older stories. In the end, we have to make that call ourselves by reading, by grappling with all of these. These books are like lessons. They're morality and courage and truth, things that are really important to grapple with. The map that they show us is the evolution of the Western myth, from something we believed in to something we question. And they show us that the West was never simply a place. It's never simply been a place, right? It's an idea we continue to wrestle with throughout the generations. So which of these would you read first? Which represents the West to you? Leave a comment, I want to know. And if you liked this video, please consider liking and subscribing. It really supports me in my work here. And I'll just leave by saying, so long, partner.